Welcome to this discussion over the heart. This will be coming from Blossom, mostly section 19.1 and just a small bit from 19.2. You will not be responsible for the majority of 19.2 through the end of the chapter. This is the beginning of material for exam 4. Exam 4 is heavily weighted on the cardiovascular system. However, there is also information included on the endocrine system, the lymphatic system, and the digestive system. So be looking for notes about those other body systems. As I begin this conversation, you should be expecting some connection questions about how the cardiovascular system is connected to other systems. So be listening for some of those or imagining some of your own connections and be formulating those ideas for exam number 4. So let's take a look at the heart. It is an amazing organ. I know I say that about everything, but the brain's amazing, the heart is amazing, and we're going to see other amazing organs as we continue through this semester. But man, the heart is amazing. You'll also be doing two labs. Labs 8 and 9 are both on the cardiovascular system, and they are coming up. And you'll be getting instructions about those in the upcoming labs. So let's take a look at the heart. Okay, here is a beautiful picture, a beautiful artist rendition of the heart, and you will, before we're done here, be introduced to all of the great vessels that come and go in and out of the heart. You'll be introduced to the vessels that bring blood to the heart and the vessels that take blood away from the heart muscle itself. You will also understand how the heart is involved in two different sets of circulations of the blood and everything that's carried in the blood. So let's get going as we move through this section 19.1. Now, you learned in the nervous system that the brain is not made up of two equal halves, right? The left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain are not equivalent. Recall that, for example, Wernicke's and Broca's area are typically found on the left side. They're not found on the right side. When they are occasionally found on the right side, they also are not found on the left. So there's also specialized regions within the two hemispheres. Same thing is true with the heart. You're going to be seeing that the heart is oftentimes referred to as a double pump. You have the left heart and the right heart, and I will use that terminology as well. And so basically what you have are two pumps side by side. They're slightly different in shape and in size and in function. If you've ever played with a pump, you know that a pump, if you think about like for a pool pump is designed to push the water, right, through the filter. And so there is definitely a pushing function of a pump, but there's also a sucking function of the pump. So the pump is sucking the water back toward it, and then it's pushing it out. So the human heart is the same way. It is both sucking blood back toward it, and it is pushing blood out away from it. So we'll see how all that works together. So let's take a look at the heart anatomy, and this will be really, really super important for the next exam. You'll be studying this rather extensively in the lab as well. I'm going to give you some numbers here. These numbers are really for you just to go, wow, right? To go, wow. So on average, if you took all the people around the world, young and old, you would say that the average heart rate is 75 contractions per minute, right? So the heart beats 75 times a minute. Again, that's an average. If you're younger, your heart probably beats a little bit slower than that. And if you're older, your heart probably beats a little bit higher than that. And now keep in mind, this number is at rest, right? This is, you're sitting there right now in your chair listening to this presentation. That means 75 times a minute that your heart is beating about 108,000 times a day. I'm not going to highlight that because it's not a number that I want you to memorize, but it is just amazing. And that means in a year about 39 million times, right? And if you look at the average lifespan, we're talking about the heart beating roughly 3 billion times in an average lifespan. Pretty amazing. Okay, now here is another number, and this one's a little bit more important. I'm going to go ahead and highlight this one. Each time that your heart beats, it is ejecting or pushing out about 70 milliliters of blood. That's not a lot, right? It's a fair amount, but it's not a huge amount of blood. So every time your heart beats, it's pushing out 70 mils of blood. Again, this is in a resting adult. If we were exercising, the heart would be beating faster and harder and would be pushing more blood to supply the muscles with the necessary blood. But this is at rest. Now, if you are if your heart is beating 75 times a minute and each time it is pushing 70 mils of blood out, that means that about every minute, and this is another number I want you to appreciate, that your heart is pushing about 5¼ liters of blood, right? About 5¼ liters of blood per minute are being pumped by your heart. Let's stop for a second. How much blood do you have in your body? We'll discuss this when we get to the blood chapter coming up in this unit. But let me just tell you now, you have between 4 and 6 liters of blood. So a large person, a male, a larger person might have the higher end, 6 liters of blood. A smaller, more petite person would have closer to the 4 to 5 liters of blood. So essentially, another way of thinking about this, your entire blood volume is circulated around essentially, right, just ish, every minute. Now, if we're pumping 5¼ liters of blood every minute, that's 14,000 liters per day. That is 10 million liters in a year, which is 2.6 million gallons of blood sent through your heart, okay? And what is even more amazing, and we'll see this again when we get to the blood vessels, also a significant part of this exam, that you have in your body roughly 60,000 miles of blood vessels. And to be honest, I've seen some books say up to 100,000 miles of blood vessels. Amazing, right? That within your body you have that many miles, friends, miles of blood vessels. Remember, every cell in your body, or most every cell in your body, is in direct connection with a blood supply. Remember, we know the exceptions. You know that epithelial tissues don't have blood supply directly nearby, though. And you know that, for example, cartilage is avascular. But the rest of all of the trillions of cells in your body have a direct connection to blood flow. So when you think about that complexity, 60,000 miles, while it kind of blows the mind, is not an unreasonable number. Now, make sure that you are definitely watching the videos as you go through the Blossom textbook. The cardiovascular system, I think, is a very visual system, and it will take a little bit of mental gymnastics to understand the flow of blood through the heart. Let me tell you now, that is a huge learning outcome for this chapter, okay, for this unit, for this exam. If you understand the flow of blood through the heart, then you understand the chambers and the valves, and you understand so much. In lab, you'll also be working through how the blood flows through the heart. So you're going to be seeing this in multiple angles. Critical, critical, critical. Now, as this diagram shows, and as you'll watch as you watch this video, we can talk about two circuits. There is a pulmonary circuit, and the pulmonary circuit are the blood vessels that the heart pumps over to and from the lungs, from the pulmonary system or the respiratory system. And then there's the systemic circuit, and that's the blood that's sent to and from all of your other systems. This is the vast majority of the circuitry through which your heart sends blood. So where is the heart located? I think we all appreciate that the heart is located in the mediastinum. We learned about the mediastinum back in Lab 1. Remember, the mediastinum is that region essentially between the lungs, found in the center of the thoracic cavity. So we find not only is the heart in the mediastinum, but so are a number of other things. For example, the trachea, right, that passes down and brings air to the lungs, is also located within the mediastinum. The esophagus, which is behind the trachea, that travels down to the stomach that's not shown here, it is also traveling down through the mediastinum. And then finally, there are the great vessels. For example, the aorta, shown here. The aorta is the great artery leaving out of the heart. And also you see here the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava coming up from the abdomen. Those are also passing through a portion of the mediastinum. So mediastinum, the middle region behind the sternum in the thoracic cavity, it is the home to the heart. One more thing that's in the mediastinum, not shown here, but on top of the heart, on the superior border of the heart, there is a small gland called the thymus, and the thymus is an endocrine gland, and you'll see that it's associated with the heart, and so it too is in the mediastinum. We learned back in lab 1 that the heart is surrounded by the pericardium. So the pericardium is shown here. Remember, that's a double layered membrane around the heart. The layer that is shrink wrapped to the surface of the heart would be the visceral pericardium. And then you can see how the author has pulled away and shown the outer layer around, and that would be the parietal pericardium. And in between, in that thin layer, there's going to be some serous fluid, which is going to help lubricate and protect the heart. So in between the pericardial membranes, between the visceral and the parietal layer, is the pericardial sac, if you will, and in there, that pericardial cavity, like I just mentioned, full of serous fluid, allows the heart to beat multiple times a day, as we know, and not build up significant heat. Where is the heart located? You can read the specifics here. I should say, as I introduce this and as you read through this, it's referring to the base of the heart, and to the base of the heart is introduced here, as is the apex of the heart. So the base of the heart, I'll go ahead and just highlight that, the base and the apex. The apex is the tip, the pointed tip that points inferiorly on the heart. The base is actually the superior surface of the heart. So it's kind of upside down, isn't it? So when you think of the word base, you would think it's on the bottom, but in fact in the heart, the superior surface, the top surface, is the base. The bottom pointy region is the apex, and you'll see that is here, the apex pointing down and to the left, okay? And then the base would be the superior border of the heart. The base is where the aorta and the superior vena cava enter and leave the heart. Also notice that the heart is shifted just a little bit over to the left side. It is protected by the sternum, okay, largely, but not completely. It's also protected by the rib cage, and you can see that it's actually directly behind that costal cartilage. So that cartilage that connects the ribs to the sternum, it's right back there. So when a person's doing CPR and they're doing compressions, you're actually pushing on that costal cartilage, which of course is more flexible than bone. And that is going to allow the actual chest compressions to squeeze or to push on the surface of the heart. Now, it is possible when people do CPR to be a little overzealous and to fracture ribs, but that's the price of keeping that person alive, doing those chest compressions. There is a inbox here about CPR. I am not expecting you to know this. You will, most of you, if you go into allied health fields, will become CPR certified, and I will leave that for that time, but just appreciate the location of the heart. And this is a really excellent inset, and it just reminds you of the hand placement over the particular ribs when you're doing the chest compressions. So the heart itself, just introduced it. It's sort of about the size of your fist. Okay, that is a good estimation of the size of your heart. So a bigger person, bigger fist, bigger heart. And the heart, the weight of it, don't worry about the numbers, but you can see that the female heart, again, on average, is a little bit smaller than the average male heart. Male heart's 11 to 12 ounces, guys. It's not even a pound, right? So we're not talking about a heavy organ. The heart is hollow, right? There are 4 hollow chambers within the heart. Now, a well-trained athlete can have a larger heart. Now, larger heart here, I want to make sure I will appreciate this later on and tell you about this. A larger heart is oftentimes considered a diseased heart. So the largeness here is overall just the muscularity of the heart. But it's also possible for the heart to enlarge over time. We'll talk about that later. And that is actually a sign of a weakened heart. Now, remember that the heart is the home of cardiac muscle, and we will finish today's presentation reviewing cardiac muscle in section 19.2. Recall that cardiac muscle is involuntary, is regulated by your autonomic nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic division can turn up your heart rate, and the parasympathetic system can turn down your heart rate. It is possible, though, like I said, a well-trained heart can be slightly enlarged, but what we don't want is a condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. This is a condition that we hear about it seems like every season we hear about a highly tuned athlete who dies on the basketball court or on the football field. And when they go to do the autopsy, they realize that this person had this pathology, this disease of the heart, hypertrophic. It becomes very enlarged. And we'll see that an enlarged heart muscle is not a healthy heart, okay? So if the heart gets large, it can't pump as efficiently. And unfortunately, this is one of those things that does not routinely get screened in health and physicals, sports physicals. It wasn't that long ago, my son was going through a sports physical season, right? Like a lot of football players have to get their physical in the summer before they can play contact practice in the fall. And there usually is every year some medical clinic somewhere who is doing a more thorough screening of hearts. It's not necessarily part of the physical exam required for sports physicals, but wow, how important it is, and it really should be. Every person who's being cleared for athletic activity really should have their heart checked to make sure they don't have this underlying condition, which is undiagnosed, completely misdiagnosed, and can result in sudden death. So let's take a look at the chambers of the heart. You're probably full aware the human heart has 4 chambers. There is a left side and a right side, the left heart and the right heart. Each side has an atrium. You know from your vocabulary that atrium means entryway. Homes you may refer to as having an atrium, or a church or a business has an atrium, an entryway. We'll see that the atria, plural, are the chambers that first receive blood. So they're the entryway into the heart. They are the more superior of the chambers. And then each side has a ventricle. The ventricle are the more muscular, we'll see that in a moment, and they are the more inferior chamber on each side. So 1 atrium, 2 atria, 1 ventricle, 2 ventricles. Make sure we're using that terminology properly. I mentioned already that we have 2 circuits, and these are quite distinct. There is the pulmonary circuit. So pulmonary circuit is transporting blood to and from the lungs. The primary job of that is done by the right heart. And then we have the systemic circuit that's transporting blood to all the other tissues of your body and returning it as well. And that's the systemic circuit. okay, the systemic circuit. So these videos are excellent. Make sure you're watching these. Make sure you're also, of course, reading and looking at these fill in the blank and the questions throughout this chapter. Let's take a look at some of the major arteries and veins and vessels that are associated with the heart. So the right ventricle, the right heart, the ventricle in the right side of the heart is going to pump deoxygenated blood. Let me just pause there. If you are watching this video first, then let me make sure you understand this idea of deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood. Deoxygenated blood is sort of a misnomer. This is not blood that is completely lacking in oxygen, although the name suggests that it is without oxygen. This blood, however, does have less oxygen in it, and this is going to be colored blue. If you don't already have a blue pencil and a red pencil, get one. It could be a blue highlighter, a blue and red marker, pencil, something like that. But as you are in lab and as you are labeling parts of the heart, red and blue are significant, very important. Now, if you don't have red and blue and you only have purple and green, that's okay, but be consistent with your coloring of the heart. And you'll see as we go through lab and through this presentation, the consistency of the colors. So the right ventricle pumps blue blood, deoxygenated blood. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and just say that over here. I was going to highlight it blue, but remember that blue is sort of my color code for things that we're going to delete, so I don't want to do that. But I'm just going to put over here that deoxygenated blood, right, is blue blood. And is going to be first pumped into the pulmonary trunk. Now it tells us two things here. Pulmonary, this is part of the pulmonary circuit. This blood is going to the lungs. Trunk, like a tree trunk, is a big vessel. And tree trunks, just like tree branches, are going to branch into smaller branches. So we're going to see that the pulmonary trunk is going to bifurcate or split into the right and left pulmonary arteries. Let me just pause for a second really quick to make sure as well that you appreciate that arteries are always, never an exception, going away from the heart. Okay, always, always, always. Arteries are going away from the heart. Veins are always going toward the heart. Okay, so that is a never false statement. Always, always, always. Okay, so when you see pulmonary arteries and down here pulmonary veins, it tells you the direction of the vessel, the direction that it is carrying blood. Arteries always away, AA, away from the heart. Veins always back toward the heart. Also, everything in the pulmonary trunk and all of the blood in the pulmonary arteries heading over to the lung, this is blue blood. It is carrying that deoxygenated blood over to the lungs where gas exchange will occur. As gas exchange occurs, carbon dioxide, CO2, is going to leave. You're going to blow that off through your respiratory system, and oxygen is going to enter. When that oxygen enters, we're going to understand this better between this chapter and more in the blood chapter, but when the oxygen enters, it changes the color of the blood, and the blood will now turn from being sort of blue blood to red blood. Okay, so that red blood is then, this highly oxygenated blood is then going to return back from the lungs to the pulmonary veins. So the pulmonary veins are carrying red blood. Okay, they're carrying red blood, highly oxygenated blood, back toward the heart. And it turns out that the pulmonary veins are now sending blood into the left atrium. So remember, this blood left from the right ventricle, it's gone to the lungs, and is now entering back to the left side of the heart into the upper chamber, the left atrium. The left atrium blood is now going to pump down to the left ventricle, And now the left ventricle is going to pump with great force blood out through the aorta to all of the systemic circuit. So you're going to see this over and over and over. This may be the first time that you're hearing this. I know it sounds confusing. That's why the videos are so important, and why paying attention in lab and labeling things will be so critical to your success in this unit. So that's how the blood gets to and from the lungs, pulmonary arteries, and pulmonary veins. Now, how does the blood get back from the body to the right side of the heart? And there are two major veins. There's the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava is going to bring blood back from every place essentially above the heart. Think head, neck, and arms. And the inferior vena cava, which is going to bring blood back from everything below the heart. Think abdomen, and legs. Okay, and we'll see that all that blood is going to dump back into the right atrium. Okay, and that blood coming back from the body is going to be that blue blood, right? So once we're in the right atrium, the blood is then going to be blue. It's already been delivered oxygen to the tissues. CO2 has been accumulated, and the right atrium pumps down to the right ventricle, and then we're back to where we started. So you're going to see this is a big cycle, and I'll show this to you in multiple ways as you learn about the flow of blood through the heart. So watch that video on the vena cava, and then you should be able to, maybe not at this very first moment, but you should soon be able to appreciate this diagram and sort of trace it with your finger, what's going on here. So we see the heart here, and let me follow the same sort of presentation as the paragraph above. So we're going to leave out of the right side, this big old vessel leaving the heart here is the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is going to split into the right and left pulmonary arteries. These are heading off to the lungs. This set of vessels represents sort of the lung over here on the left and right. We see that the blood going to the lungs is blue. It's deoxygenated. You see here in the middle a little hint of purple. That purple, whenever you see purple in this unit, purple is going to represent where gas exchange is happening, where red and blue blood mix. So whenever you see purple, it's telling you something. That is where there is gas exchange going on. Once that gas exchange occurs, the blood now is a bright red. The blood's going to return to the heart through the pulmonary veins. Again, and there are two of them. So there's two pulmonary veins on either side. One pulmonary artery, two pulmonary veins. They're bringing blood back to the left side. The left side is then going to pump the blood out the aorta here. Some of that blood is going to go up to the brain. Some of that blood is going to go down and go to the rest of your body. Again, this is just a simplified overview of how this works. That red blood that is being pumped out is carrying oxygen. You see a hint of purple representing gas exchange in the capillaries. Then we come back through a series of veins. The veins from below the heart are going to dump back up into the inferior vena cava. The veins coming back from the head and the neck are going to come through the superior vena cava, and these two major veins are going to merge back, not really merge, but both dump into the right atrium. So soon you'll be able to trace this with very great confidence. So taking a look at this anatomically correct diagram of the heart. The heart here has been cut open in a frontal or coronal section, and there are two things about this diagram that are critical. One, it shows the color of the blood, and it shows the directionality of the flow. So again, let me go through this with you. So we see blood coming down. This is the superior vena cava coming from the body, specifically from the neck, the head, the arms. This blood is coming down. It is already delivered as oxygen. It's coming back as blue deoxygenated blood. Simultaneously, there's blood coming up. I wish there was an upward arrow right here so you could see this, but up from the body. Again, this is the inferior vena cava bringing blood back up from the core from the abdominal region and from the legs. That blood all merges and dumps into here, the right atrium. We'll talk about the valves in a minute. But from the right atrium, the blood's going to go down into the right ventricle, then up and through another valve. Into here is the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is the thicker, wider, combined region, if you will. And then we see the pulmonary trunk split, right and left pulmonary arteries. Now it's not showing it going over here, but it would continue over here and go over to the right lung over here and the left lung over here. Remember when I just said right and left that we're looking into a person's body, right? And so we have to think about anatomic position. The apex down here is pointing to the left. So this is the left side of the heart, left side of the body, left lung over here. This is the right side. Okay, this is the right side. This is the right heart that is showing the blue blood. So the blood's going to go off to the lungs. It's going to come back through those pulmonary veins, 2 veins shown here, draining into the left atrium. Now, the same thing's happening over here. We just can't see it. Coming into the left atrium, down through the valve that we'll discuss, down into the left ventricle, and then up and out into the aorta. Okay, and the aorta is going to branch off from the top and go to the brain and the arms. And what we don't see here, the aorta continues behind the heart and then would appear here, inferiorly traveling to the abdominal region and down to the legs. So what's great about this image is it shows you the color and it shows you the directionality of the flow. Let's talk about the outside of the heart and then we'll go back inside the heart. You know from the introduction today as well as from lab 1 long ago that there is the serous membrane that is wrapped around the heart. Again, the pericardial layers, the pericardial sac. This video goes through that for you as a review, and you can see here even the 2 layers that are associated with and around the heart. Remember that the pericardium, like the other serous membranes, the peritoneum and the pleura, all it is, remember, it is nothing more than a simple squamous epithelium. So the visceral layer and the parietal layer are just that. Now, there is, however, another part to the pericardium, unlike the other serous membranes, and that is around the heart there is an additional outer layer called the fibrous pericardium. You'll see this coming up in a video, and you'll see it coming up with some diagrams. So the fibrous pericardium is a, quote, third outer layer of the pericardium, and this fibrous pericardium, unlike the serous layers, unlike the visceral or the parietal layers, is made up of a dense connective tissue. And this fibrous pericardium is going to make sure that the heart is better protected, also helps to maintain its position, and this fibrous pericardium is partly attached to, think about it, attached to the sternum, holding the heart in place. It's also attached down to the diaphragm. So the heart is being held in place by this tough connective tissue sac called the fibrous pericardium, and that sac is attached to the sternum and to the diaphragm. Now, another term is to learn. You've learned about the visceral pericardium. You know that that's the shrink-wrapped layer to the surface of the heart. That layer has another name. So it's also called the epicardium. So these two are the same. Visceral pericardium, aka the epicardium, and these are synonymous terms. Okay, I think of this as again being that fused or shrink-wrapped layer to the surface. It's very thin. In lab, you're going to get to dissect a heart. Some of you will have fresh hearts. Some of you will have preserved hearts. Regardless, when you have what you think is just the heart in your hands, there is a very thin layer all around it. Remember, it's just simple squamous. It's something you're not going to be able to visualize, okay? Just know that it's there. So think of the shiny surface of the heart as being the visceral pericardium, aka the epicardium. Let's take a look at that a little bit more completely. And here we see, again, the double layer. So the visceral pericardium, aka the epicardium, is that thin layer shrink wrapped to the surface of the heart. And then there is the parietal pericardium. That layer is the outer layer. And in between is that pericardial sac where there's fluid, right? That pericardial fluid, that lubricating fluid. What this diagram is not showing is that even around the outside of this, there would be that fibrous pericardium. The fibrous pericardium would be external to the parietal pericardium. Another name for the serous membranes is mesothelium. Mesothelium. So if you hear about the mesothelium, that means that it is derived from, remember, the mesothelium, right, is derived from the mesoderm. So the mesoderm is that middle layer of the early embryo. The mesothelium is derived from that layer. And again, it is simply a simple squamous epithelium. Okay, so that's what we already know about. We already know about this, right? We look at the heart muscle here, and we see again. We're going to kill this until you know it well. But here is the visceral pericardium shrink wrapped to the surface of the heart itself. This is the heart muscle. You know that if we zoom into this, we're going to see, in fact, let's do that. Even in this artist rendition, you can see that this is cardiac muscle. You can see those intercalated discs. You can see the branching, right? You see the branching that occurs of this type, and you can also see the striations. So even in this artist rendition, you can see that. You can also see there are lots of blood vessels, right, that are going down into and around the heart muscle, supplying the ever needed oxygen to create the ATP to keep the heart pumping. Then here is that parietal pericardium. Okay, again, simple squamous, this purple layer, simple squamous epithelium, and that is the second layer of the serous membrane. And then outside of that would be that fibrous pericardium. When we get to the respiratory system, I will describe pleurisy. Pleurisy is when there's a fluid buildup between the serous membrane, between the pleural layers around the lungs. And that fluid buildup makes it difficult for the lungs to expand. It makes it difficult for the person to breathe. Likewise, it's possible for fluid to build up in the pericardial space. I think this picture really gives us an idea of what that might look like. And this extra fluid, of course, is going to create pressure, make the heart work harder. And this is just an example of how fluid can build up in this area. It can be serous fluid. It could also be more oftentimes blood that can accumulate in there. But again, that just makes it harder for the heart to do its work. This is one of those conditions that can lead to death if it is not surgically corrected, typically by puncturing the pericardial membrane and just draining that fluid out. Now let's take a look at the external features of the heart. Okay, this is one of those pictures or likenesses thereof you're going to be labeling multiple times in lab, in your online homework, and I definitely recommend that you also take a look in your Hebert Lab Atlas and take a close look at the models that are given in the atlas for the heart, all labeled up for you, beautiful presentations. So let's go over this. There's a couple things here I've already introduced. Let me just point out, let's get our orientation. here is the apex of the heart. Okay, that's the pointy, the conical end of the heart. This is pointing to the left side. If I were to take a scalpel and puncture into the apex, I am in the left ventricle. So keep that in mind. The apex is a portion of the left ventricle. The base of the heart is up here where I'm pointing. This is basically the top of the heart. It is where we see the pulmonary trunk leave. It's where we leave. It's where we see the aorta leave the heart. It's also where we see the superior vena cava, and sneaking up from behind the inferior vena cava, all sort of merge. So these four, what's called the great vessels, the four great vessels, two of them are veins, the vena cava, two of them are arteries, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. They are all essentially associated with the base of the heart. So it's important you know the four great vessels. Let's take a look at another surface feature, and that is the auricle. The auricle, now you've seen the term auricle before. Remember, the flappy portion of your ear is called the auricle. Okay, the flappy portion of your ear. So the ear, just like the ear has two auricles, or the body has two auricles, two ears, there are these two auricles, these two flappy regions on the surface of the heart. Now it's pretty easy. Remember, the apex is on the left side. So the auricle on the same side is going to be the left auricle. The left auricle is a continuation with the left atrium below, or deep to that. And then the other auricle that you'll see over, more closely associated with the vena cava, this is the right auricle. Again, it is deep to the right auricle is the right atrium. So I have just given you the surface features for 3 of the 4 chambers. If you were to take a scalpel and go deep to the right auricle, you'd be in the right atrium. Go deep to the left auricle, you'd be in the left atrium. Go deep to the apex, you're in the left ventricle. Over here, the one region we haven't looked at, this would be the right ventricle over on this side. On the surface of the heart, you can see that there are vessels. These are the coronary arteries and the cardiac veins. These vessels, we'll see them in a moment in more detail, but they are the vessels that are carrying blood to the heart muscle. That would be the red colored coronary arteries. The blue cardiac veins are returning that deoxygenated blood back toward the heart to be recycled. There are a couple of sulci. Remember, on the brain, a sulcus was a shallow groove. So too, on the surface of the heart, there are a couple of sulci for you to know. One is the coronary sulcus. It essentially goes around the heart. Okay, it goes around the heart. It's called the coronary sulcus. The other name for this sulcus, is the Atrioventricular sulcus. So I'm going to go ahead and find where that is listed. Yes. So the coronary sulcus is also called, aka, the atrioventricular. And you're going to see this word atrioventricular a lot. And all it means, right, it's the groove, the sulcus, that is in between the atria on the top and the ventricles down below. So this is that coronary sulcus, okay, aka the atrioventricular, because it's separating, think about it, it's separating the atria externally from the ventricles. Now there's another sulcus, two other sulci. One is down the front of the heart, and it's called, don't make this hard, the anterior interventricular sulcus. Anterior, in the front, inter, between, ventricles, there's a groove, right? Anterior interventricular sulcus. So right here, where these coronary arteries are sort of on the outside of the heart, they are sitting in this groove, protected in part. And so if I were to take a labeling marker, right, I would say everything on this side, right, everything over here is the left ventricle. Everything on this side is the right ventricle. Again, inter means between. So that sulcus is between the ventricles. So again, externally, all of these external landmarks or clues tell you more about what's going on inside the heart. This is an anterior view on the top. On the bottom, we have a posterior view, or more of a bottom view. So now we can clearly see the inferior vena cava coming up and going into the right atrium. Here's the superior vena cava coming down, dumping also into the right atrium. We don't see the right auricle. It's hiding on the other side here. We do get a glimpse of the left auricle right here. Remember, I have no problem remembering this is the left auricle because there's the apex, which is on the left side of the heart. So that's always going to give you your orientation. Here, if we were to flip this around, think about it. The pulmonary trunk comes up and splits into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Those are heading off to the respective lungs. That blood then comes back through the respective pulmonary veins, 2 pulmonary veins on the right, 2 pulmonary veins on the left, and they are merging into the left atrium. Can't see it here, but deep to this is the left atrium, which is deep to that left auricle. Coming around the backside, and only on the backside, there is a very large vein. This vein has the name coronary sinus. Sinus, recall, is a large space, right? In the brain, we saw the dural sinuses, or you also saw, even more specifically, like the superior sagittal sinus. Remember, those were the blood-filling regions of the brain. They were filled with blue blood, weren't they? Filled with blue blood. So same way here, all of these cardiac veins that we see on the surface of the heart are going to drain up and fill into this coronary sinus. Also, not to confuse you, but the coronary sinus is in the groove called the coronary sulcus. Okay, so the coronary sinus is the vessel, and it is sitting partly protected in that groove called the coronary sulcus. So there is the front and the back external features anatomy of the heart. Oh, didn't say it. Back here on the back side, there is a posterior interventricular sulcus. So this is the groove on the back side of the heart between the ventricles. On one side we have the left side, the apex associated side. On the other side and up around would be the right ventricle over on this side. Here there is a 3-dimensional model that you can interact with to study more about the heart. And now let's take a look at the layers of the heart itself. 3 layers, not equal at all in their shape, but this video goes through those 3 layers. Let me describe them to you. From superficial to deep, there's the epicardium. We've already seen that word. That's the outer layer, right? Also called the visceral pericardium. Then there's the myocardium. You have enough vocabulary knowledge to know that this is the muscle layer. Myo, muscle of the heart, myocardium. And then the inside layer is the endocardium. You know, endo means within. So the endocardium is essentially the layer that comes in contact with the blood. The endocardium is the inside of both the ventricles and the atria, and you can think of it as being in contact with the blood. Again, the myocardium is the muscle layer. It is the thickest of these 3 layers, and it's made up exclusively of cardiac muscle cells. And you know what cardiac muscle looks like under the microscope. We'll review it briefly here today, but that is making up the myocardium. Great video to watch to give you a better look at this, and yet another video that goes through the layers of the heart. This will go through the epicardium, the myocardium, the endocardium, as well as we'll go through, I think I just did that backwards. So out here we have the serous membrane. So here is your parietal pericardium, Here's that space, the parietal, so the pericardial cavity. Here is the visceral pericardium, aka the epicardium. Here is the very thick layer of myocardium, and then on the inside there is the endocardium. And if we were in the heart, right here where I'm touching, this would be blood filled in the chambers. You don't really get to appreciate this by looking at the heart, although even when you look up at previous drawings of the heart, if I look up here, sorry for going back up, but notice the author has tried to include the directionality of the fibers. Remember, fibers in this conversation, muscle fibers are muscle cells. And you can see that there's a grain to the muscle, or there is a directionality of the muscle fibers, and that directionality changes as you look over here. So this diagram down here, I really like this one. It does a nice job, not to memorize this, but what you see is that the fibers around the heart are not just in one direction. What this does is that when the heart squeezes, when the ventricles squeeze, it doesn't just squeeze the heart, but it twists the heart. Imagine when you're mopping, right? You got an old-fashioned mop, and you twist that water out of the fibers of the mop. Same idea. So when the heart contracts, it's twisting the muscles of the myocardium, the muscle cells, and that is causing the blood to leave the heart with greater force and more completion. Remember, I used a number earlier. About 70 milliliters of blood get pumped out with each contraction of the heart. Now, another significant difference between the left heart and the right heart is nicely illustrated in this artistic rendition. And what you see is that the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart are quite different in their muscularity. Specifically, the left ventricle is much, much thicker, much thicker than the right ventricle. Okay. You also see the left ventricle is smaller than the right ventricle. The right ventricle has a larger space. The left ventricle is smaller and tighter. Now, why is this? The reason is the right ventricle doesn't have to be very strong. It only has to pump the blood with enough force, right? The right ventricle only has to pump the blood with enough force to get it over to the lungs, right? The pulmonary circuit's not very large. The lungs are not very far away. So it doesn't need a lot of force. Therefore, it also doesn't need as much muscularity. However, the left side, oh my goodness, this is the real workhorse of the heart. The left side must be very thick, and it must be very muscular so that it can pump the blood up toward the brain through the aorta, as well as send blood down all the way to your big toe. So it's the left ventricle that does all the work. Not all, but the majority of the hard work of the heart is here in the left ventricle, because it must pump blood up and out of the heart against gravity, push that blood up through your vessels to your brain, as well as push the blood out with enough force to perfuse. That's a fancy word that just basically means bringing blood to the organs. So you have to get adequate blood flow to your liver, to your kidneys, to all your other organs, right? Need adequate blood flow. And your big toe needs blood too. So we've got to have a lot of force of the blood leaving the left ventricle. Now let me ask this question now. We see that the right ventricle is larger in size, and I've told you that it pumps under less pressure. The left ventricle is smaller in size and pumps out with greater pressure. But tell me about the volume of blood. What volume of blood is pumped out of the right side of the heart versus the left side of the heart? Do you think there is more blood out of the right side, more blood out of the left side? What do you think? And a lot of students fall for this. They think, oh, the right side is bigger, so it must be pumping more blood. Or they think the left side is having to send blood to the brain, so it must be pumping more blood. In reality, though, the left and right sides of the heart work in concert. So the amount of blood being pumped from the right side matches the amount of blood from the left side. Now that's in a healthy heart. In a healthy heart, the two sides are pumping the same volume. Think about it for a second. If one side was pumping more or less blood, there'd be a backup or an overflow of blood somewhere in the body. That's not what we want. So in a healthy cardiovascular system, the left and right heart, even though they're pumping under different pressures, they're pumping the same volume. Okay, they're pumping the same volume. Continue with your reading about the endocardium, and the endocardium is lined also with a layer of simple squamous epithelium. This is nicknamed the endothelium. Okay, now we're going to be seeing the word endothelium quite a bit. Remember, we have seen epithelium, right? We know about epithelium. That is what's covering your body. If we think about the stratified squamous keratinized, we have stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium in our mouth, down the esophagus, anus, and vagina. We've seen mesothelium, right? Mesothelium, again, was AKA your serous membranes. And now we have endothelium. Well, guess what, guys? It is derived from the endoderm, right? It's derived from the inner layer of your early embryo. And this is the name of the simple squamous epithelium that lines your blood vessels and your heart chambers. Okay, so the endothelium is just a code word for the simple squamous epithelium that is lining your blood vessels and your chambers of the heart, the endothelium, or the endocardium. Remember, we have 60,000 plus miles of blood vessels. They're all lined by simple squamous epithelium. Wow. Right? You really start to get a sense of the complexity and the awesomeness of this system. Now, your heart is constantly beating, as we know, but we learned back in the autonomic nervous system that not all organs are getting the same blood flow 24/7. Remember, we talked about the sympathetic nervous system, and when you are in a fight or flight moment, more blood is being pumped to your muscles. Remember what happens to your skin? Right? When you're scared, you go white. What's going on? Blood from your dermis is not completely, but is largely shuttled to the inside of your body, to your muscles, in preparation of fighting. Remember too that in a sympathetic nervous system surge, your digestive system, your urinary system, your reproductive organs, they also lose, not all, but more blood is shunted away from those organs to your muscles. Your brain is going to receive the same amount of blood all the time. That the brain receives the same amount of blood. I don't care if you're scared or relaxing. The brain must have a constant 24/7 supply of blood. Remember too that in parasympathetic, that some organs get more blood. During parasympathetic rest and digest, your muscles have less blood, but your digestive, your urinary, your reproductive organs, and your skin have more blood flow. So my point is this: there must be a way that the heart pumps the blood, but then some organs receive more blood and some organs receive less blood. And that is going to be the magic. We'll talk about that when we get to the blood vessels in another presentation. But there's vasoconstriction, vasodilation, opening and closing of different blood vessels going to different organs that allows for certain organs to receive more blood or less blood based upon the homeostatic needs of the body. So let's now travel inside the heart. We talked about the external structures, the layers around the heart. Now let's head inside. Inside the heart, remember there's 4 chambers. Those 4 chambers must be separated, and they are separated by septa. Just like you have a nasal septum, you have septa inside your heart, which are separating the chambers one from another. These are physical, if you will, separators. Between the 2 atria is the interatrial septum. Don't make this difficult. We know inter means between. So between the atria, there's a divider, a septum. And in the, we'll see the same thing to be true down in the ventricles. Between the 2 ventricles, there's another septum called the interventricular septum. Now of note, in the interatrial septum, there is an oval-shaped depression called the fossa ovalis. The fossa ovalis. Now, you're going to see this in all the adult heart models. Okay? And what is the fossa ovalis? We know what it is. The fossa, we know, is an indented region, and it's oval in shape. As a fetus, before you were born, your heart had a hole called the foramen ovale. Okay, we know foramen means hole or opening. It was an oval-shaped opening between the atria. So as a fetus, you have a foramen ovale. After you're born, and as an adult, you have a fossa ovalis. The way I remember this, ovalis, what is now, right? So the fossa ovalis is what is now. The foramen was the opening found in the fetus. You'll learn a little bit more about that coming up. You'll also see this in the lab. And what you'll see is that the foramen ovale allows for blood to jump directly from the right atrium over to the left atrium. Thereby, much of the blood bypasses the pulmonary circuit. And you'll appreciate that more as we go through this, go through lab, as well as start to understand the circulation of the blood through the heart better. So within seconds after birth, a flap of tissue called the septum primum, just a little flap, begins to close down that foramen and begins to create the fossa ovalis. Again, we'll look at this in more detail. Definitely take a look at this video that describes for you and visually shows you the septa. In addition to the septa that separate, there are also 4 valves, and these 4 valves are going to separate the chambers and the outflowing vessels, and these valves are going to assure that blood only moves in one direction through the heart. 2 of these valves are called atrioventricular valves. They're abbreviated the AV valves. It tells you exactly where they are. They're between the atrium and the ventricle. So on the right side, there's the right atrioventricular valve. On the left side, there's the left atrioventricular valve. Again, you'll be labeling all of this. The other 2 valves are referred to as the semilunar valves. Semilunar valves. And one of these semilunar valves goes up into the aorta, and one of these semilunar valves goes up into the pulmonary trunk. Also, while I'm here, I'll tell you that the atrioventricular valves are also and probably more commonly referred to as the bicuspid valve and the tricuspid valve. So you'll see that word quite a bit. I will say now, and I'll show you in a moment, in the heart, you try it before you buy it. So the tricuspid valve, we're going to see, comes before the bicuspid. Try it before you buy it. Tricuspid before the bicuspid. All of these septa help to create what's referred to as the cardiac skeleton, or also called the fibrous skeleton of the heart. Just like your body has a bony skeleton, right, that gives it shape, so too the heart has a fibrous skeleton, not made of bone, but made of connective tissue. And this fibrous skeleton, we're going to see, wraps around the valves and helps to separate the atria from the ventricles. And this cardiac skeleton also creates an important divider between the atria and the ventricles when it comes to the electrical conduction, the electrical signal that passes through the heart. Now, the electrical signal of the heart will be a discussion for the physiology part of the cardiovascular system next semester. So next semester in lab, you will be experiencing how to read EKGs, learning more about blood pressure, how to take blood pressure, how to listen to heart sounds. Also, again, learn how to read about 8 or 9 common EKG patterns and some arrhythmias of the heart. So this semester we'll introduce all of the pieces and parts. Next semester you'll better understand the physiology. So now let's take a look at this coronally cut heart, and this one does a couple nice things. It does show us the directionality of the blood flow, and the arrows represent the color of the blood in that section. And this chamber, or this particular view, also shows us the valves. So let's get the valves figured out right now. Now, there are 2 valves between the atria and the ventricle. So here's the right atrium, here's the right ventricle. Blood leaves the right atrium, passes down through this valve into the right ventricle. This is the tricuspid. This is also the right atrioventricular valve. Right, so the tricuspid, aka the right AV valve, atrioventricular valve. Then over here, here's the left atrium, here's the left ventricle. Blood is going to go from the left atrium down through this valve. This valve is 3 names for this valve, guys. 3 names for this valve. And you need to know all of them. So let me find where it's mentioned right here. So the bicuspid valve. Okay, the bicuspid valve. I'm going to change the colors on that. The bicuspid valve is also called the mitral valve, which is also called the left, I'm just going to abbreviate it, the left AV valve, okay, the left atrioventricular valve. So these are all referring to the same valve. You need to learn all 3 names. Likewise, the tricuspid, put it all right here, the tricuspid is also called the right atrial valve, the right atrioventricular valve. Okay, so make sure you know these equivalent terms. So in this diagram, they're labeling this valve as the mitral valve, aka the bicuspid, aka the left atrioventricular valve. Remember I told you in the heart we try it, tricuspid, before we buy it, bicuspid. I'll say it now and then it's introduced here in a moment. These atrioventricular valve have string-like structures coming down from them. These are tendinous cords, from the Latin the Chordae tendineae. And these Chordae tendineae come down and anchor the valve, and they anchor the valve down to muscles called the papillary muscles. Now the papillary muscles are only found in the ventricles. You know from previous experience that papillary refers to nipple-shaped. So you can see these are nipple-shaped muscles. They're protruding from the wall of the ventricle. The right side of the heart, because it's the tricuspid, will have 3 papillary muscles. They're not all shown in this particular diagram, but there are 3 papillary muscles attached to the 3 portions of the valve. Remember, cusp means points. So the tricuspid valve has 3 parts to it. The bicuspid valve, you kind of get the idea, only goes down to 2 papillary muscles. Okay, 2 papillary muscles on the left side for the bicuspid or mitral valve. The other 2 valves, shown here, this valve is blocking the entryway to the pulmonary trunk. So this is the pulmonary valve. This valve here is blocking the entrance to the aorta. This is the aortic valve. Now note that the aorta flips back behind the pulmonary trunk, and this is why in lab I introduced to you, quote, a square heart. It's just a whole lot easier to draw as you are first learning about the heart structures. But you will need to eventually be able to appreciate the complexity, sort of the crisscrossing of the vessels here in the anatomically correct heart. I think, there's a couple things that are labeled here that I did not introduce. Let me just mention them now, get this a little bit larger. Trabeculae carnae. If you look at the ventricle and only in the ventricle, remember that word trabeculae? We've seen it a couple of times. Spongy bone is also called trabecular bone, and spongy bone kind of looks like this, right? So what you have is along the bottom of the right and left ventricles, this arrangement of the tissue is called the trabeculae carnae. Man, when I hear that word, I think some sort of carne asada, right? So carne just means, meat, right? So trabeculae carnae is just this trabecular looking muscle or meat that we find here in the ventricles. This diagram also labels the interatrial septum. Man, that's tough in a cut like this, but the interatrial septum does divide the left atrium from the right atrium, and then down here is the interventricular septum. It divides, this is much easier to see, it's dividing the left ventricle from the right ventricle. Here's another video that you can interact with. Oh, I just went past it. A little video or a little 3D model you can interact with, and it has everything labeled for you. Okay, so let's get past this. And let's now sort of travel through the heart. Here is the right atrium. So let's go through the 4 chambers. So the right atrium, it is, the blood going through the heart is sort of a cycle, if you will, and we can start anywhere, but by convention, this book and the lab book and my discussions, we're going to start the blood flow coming into the heart in the right atrium, okay? And this is the receiving blood. This is the blue blood, the systemic blood, the deoxygenated blood that's coming in from both the superior and the inferior vena cava. Now there's a third place by which blood comes into the right atrium. I introduced this in the pre-lab video as well, and that is that coronary sinus. Remember, the coronary sinus was that blue vessel that collected all of the blood coming back from the cardiac muscle, right, from the cardiac veins. So there's 3 ways by which blood gets to the right atrium: superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the CS, the coronary sinus. That blood is going to come in, okay, come into the right atrium. Again, the superior vena cava is bringing blood back from the superior regions, the head, the neck, the upper limbs, and the thoracic region, whereas the inferior vena cava is draining blood back from everything below the diaphragm, below the heart, and that is the lower limbs and the abdominal pelvic region. When blood comes into the right atrium, the internal surface of the right atrium and the left atrium is smooth. We'll see that fossa ovalis, and within the right atrium, and you'll see this in some of the diagrams, there are some ridges of muscle referred to as the pectinate muscles. Okay, the right auricle has pectinate muscles. The left atrium has a little bit of the pectinate muscles as well in the auricle. And I'll show this to you in a picture, but just in case I forget, pectin. What the pectinate muscle looks like to me is when you're peeling an orange, right? The white stuff part of that white stuff that makes up the peel, and that white stuff is called pectin. That's just the name of the stuff that makes up that sort of that white membrane that goes around the orange. And so that's kind of what I look when I see this in pictures. The pectinate muscles kind of look like that pectin layer, sort of that ridgy sort of stuff that goes around an orange. We're going to go down to the right ventricle. Again, the right ventricle is receiving blood from the right atrium. Everything on the right side continues down to the right side. The blood is going to go down through the right atrioventricular valve, or that tricuspid valve. That tricuspid valve is held on by those Chordae tendineae, okay, or quote, your heartstrings, right? We have all heard about the heartstrings, pulling on your heartstrings. Literally in your heart, you've got these heartstrings, right? They are 80% collagen, not something you would want to eat. So when people do eat heart, they have to get rid of these collagenous fibers. They're a little bit stretchy, a little bit of elastic, but mostly very, very strong collagen fibers. And again, I've told you this earlier, but here it is in words. Those Chordae tendineae go down to the papillary muscles. They go down to the ventricular wall. 3 of these papillary muscles are in the right ventricle, and we'll see that on the left side there are only 2 of these. Here are those Chordae tendineae. You'll get to see this when you dissect your heart. Here are the papillary muscles to which those Chordae tendineae attach, and we can also see the trabecular carne, sort of that trabecular structure that we find on the ventricular wall. When the right ventricle contracts, blood will be ejected into the pulmonary trunk. To get there, it had to go through the pulmonary valve, or the pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay, so all that's detailed here. Once the blood has gone to the lungs and comes back through those pulmonary veins, we're now going to come back into, there are 4 of those pulmonary veins, 2 on the left, 2 on the right, and that blood is going to enter into the left atrium. Now, the left atrium is, and everything on the left side is going to be red blood. This is blood that's coming back from the lungs. It's been highly oxygenated. When blood is oxygenated, it is bright red. You've all cut yourself, and you know that blood, as it comes out of your vessels, is bright red. And if you've ever given blood, you know that when you give blood, they take blood from a vein, and that blood in that tube is not very red, right? The blood that you donate comes out of your veins. That is, quote, blue blood, and it is a much darker, bricky burgundy color. So the left atrium is receiving red blood, oxygenated blood, okay? And this blood is then going to travel from the left atrium. It's going to go down through the mitral valve, aka the bicuspid, aka the left atrioventricular valve, down into the left ventricle. Again, the same amount of blood is going to come down from the left side and the right side. The difference is the left side is much more muscular, so it is going to contract under greater force. Remember, on the left side, we only have 2 papillary muscles for the bicuspid valve. When the blood is pumping out of the left ventricle under high power, it's going to be going up into the aortic valve, into the aorta, and off to the systemic circuit. So just a reminder about those heart valves, right? The right atrioventricular is also the tricuspid, right? 3 flaps, 3 parts, 3 papillary muscles on the right side. On the left side, we instead have the mitral bicuspid, or the left AV valve, with only 2 parts and only 2 papillary muscles. The other 2 valves are the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. The aortic valve is also referred to as the pulmonary semilunar valve. You'll hear it pronounced also pulmonic, right? Change the syllables around. So pulmonary valve or the pulmonic valve. And this one has three little flaps that are allowing blood to go up into the pulmonary trunk. And then finally, there is the aortic valve. This one is, in all these valves, are preventing backflow. You do not want backflow. If you have backflow coming through your heart valves, that means that blood, that makes sense, but if blood is going backwards, that means not as much blood is pushing forward. And if your heart is not pushing blood out in adequate volumes, then your body is not getting the necessary oxygen and blood flow, and your heart is having to work much more hard to get the blood to your body. Now, when these valves open and close, there's a sound, okay? Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. So when a doctor or nurse is listening to your heart and they are putting the stethoscope on your chest, the next time you get an evaluation, notice they're having you breathe and they're moving that stethoscope to 4 places. Why are they moving that stethoscope to 4 places? Because they are positioning the stethoscope to hear the opening and closing of the 4 valves. So 4 locations, 4 valves. Okay. Also, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but when the tricuspid valve is open, so too is the bicuspid valve. So the 2 AV valves open and close together, and the 2 semilunar valves, the aortic and pulmonary valves, they're going to open and close also in a coordinated way. So that's where the lub and dub, the what's called the sound 1 or the sound 2, S1, S2. So when you listen again, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, those are the valves open. Actually, the sound is the percussive closing of the valve. And not only is the valve closing, but there's also blood that is immediately stopped. And so the combination of the closing of the valve and the blood that kind of bumps up against that closed door is what creates the heart sounds. Okay, so what I just said is here in these 2 pictures, and that is these valves open and close in a coordinated way. The right side working in concert with the left side. Now, can things go wrong? Absolutely. Can a valve be faulty? One of the 4 valves be faulty? Absolutely. And let's think about that for just a second. Which of the 4 valves do you think is the one that has to work the hardest and is more often the one that is going to go bad? So if a person's going to have a bad valve and have to have a valve replacement, which valve do you think is the one working the hardest? Remember, the valves open to allow blood to pass, but when they close, they're also preventing backflow. They're working against that back pressure, keeping blood from going backwards. So I hope you're thinking and imagining that the mitral valve is the one that is more commonly going to get damaged or show some sort of leakage. Think about it. When the left ventricle contracts, it is contracting under tremendous force. That blood is being pushed up and out through the aortic valve, but at that point, the mitral valve is closed and it is having to resist that pressure of the left ventricle so that blood does not go back up into the left atrium. And so for that reason, the mitral valve is the one that is really being worked the most and the one that is more likely to fail. Again, that's all described here for you in words. Now, this chapter does a beautiful job describing heart valves, different heart valve conditions, also goes through surgical replacement of the valves. It's very, very well done. I'm not going to hold you to this though. But I think you can appreciate that here is a valve, right? And this is the mitral valve. And you see these chordae tendineae coming down, and This is just referring to infections. There are some infections, streptococcus infection, scarlet fever, which can actually cause damage to the valves. Okay, so that's one reason why valves can become sick or dysfunctional. There's endocarditis, right? Inflammation of the inner layer, and not only is the endothelium coated by the endocardium, not only is the endocardium lined by the endothelium, that same endothelium lines your valves. So infection of that endothelium can cause valvular damage. When there is a weak valve, literally with the stethoscope, you can hear regurgitation. You can hear backflow. A leaky valve, you'll hear it referred to in two ways. One, regurgitation, but you'll also hear it referred to as a murmur. So if you hear about someone who has a heart murmur, it's code for they have a valve that is not closing all the way down. And for whatever reason, right, disease, genetics, some sort of congenital deformity, that valve is not closing all the way down, leading to blood going backwards. If that backflow of blood is sufficient, such that the heart is not getting blood moving out with enough force, then that valve may need to be replaced. If the leakage is minimal, it won't need to be replaced. Doctor, just watch that murmur, listen for it each and every year, and make sure that it's not getting worse. So in this section, it goes through this. It shows you a couple of the different types of artificial valves that are being replaced. Some people get pig valves. Pig hearts are very similar to human hearts. We can take valves from pigs. We can take valves from human donors, right? Now, this is not a donor like giving up a kidney, but from cadavers and from when a person is an organ donor. One part of that organ donor that can be donated is the valves for someone whose heart valves are deficient, or we can have different types of mechanical valves as well. So I'm not going to go through any of these procedures, but it's very interesting, and you may have a family member who has been through a situation like this. Let's talk about the coronary circulation for a moment. That is, what are the coronary arteries on the outside of the heart? There are 4 of these, actually 6 vessels altogether that I'm going to introduce you to. You'll also see them in the lab. So, I will use this diagram first. As soon as blood comes up from the left ventricle, goes through the aortic valve and comes up into the aorta, immediately there are 2 coronary arteries. There's one off to the right, and there's one that comes off the left. So that's the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. Now, the right coronary artery has most often two main branches. Okay, the right coronary artery goes on to become the marginal artery. Let the name speak to you. It runs along the margin, along the edge of the heart. Okay, the marginal artery. And we'll see in a moment that it also is going to go to the back of the heart and go to the posterior interventricular. So it's here in words, right? Typically, the right coronary artery splits into the marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. Okay, so those you'll see in the diagrams. And the left coronary artery splits into the circumflex. I think of it, it flexes, it bends, circum around. Circumflex kind of wraps up around the left auricle and into the anterior interventricular artery. Okay, so that's that. Those facts are down here. Okay, or is it up here? Let me find it. Somewhere up here. It's up here. There it is. The left coronary artery splits into the circumflex and the anterior interventricular. Okay. Now, your heart and my heart, if we were to do an angiogram, which would be a visualization of the vessels of the heart, you would see that your circulation of your heart's almost like a fingerprint. Everyone's got slightly different arrangements of branches. So no two heart vessels have exactly the same, but these branches, these two major branches of each of the right and left coronary arteries, are pretty consistently found in most individuals. Okay, so that is shown here. Here's your front view, here's your posterior view, and here is that marginal artery, kind of runs along the margin of the heart, and also that posterior interventricular artery. Again, these are branches of the right coronary artery. There's also a series of cardiac veins that you see traveling back from the heart muscle, and they all, again, are going to merge onto that coronary sinus, which is only present on the posterior surface. When you look at your heart sample, your specimen, you will be clearly able to see the coronary sinus. It'll be very obvious to you. Going back up, there's a great video here on these coronary arteries, so definitely take this to appreciate the anatomy here. Now, if a person, let me go here, these coronary arteries are the very vessels that get blocked in a heart attack. Okay, so let me point this out. So let's say you have a blockage right here, right, a complete blockage here. That means that this portion of the heart would not receive oxygen. Just like the brain, the heart is very, very sensitive to a lack of oxygen, and quickly after a lack of oxygen, the heart muscle cells die, and sort of like neurons, cardiac muscle does not regenerate very well at all. So once cardiac muscle dies, it is dead forever. It is replaced by scar tissue and no longer contributes to the pumping strength of the heart. So if you have a small vessel blockage and you have a small region of the heart that is died right from the heart attack, you're going to survive that heart attack. A small part of the heart has been damaged. The heart's a little bit weaker, but this person's going to survive this fully. However, what if that blockage is up here? Right, and if that blockage is up here and all of your, basically your marginal artery and your posterior interventricular and essentially half of the heart circulation is cut off, that would be considered a massive coronary. And that is not a heart attack that a person can survive. They might survive for a day or two, right? They get into the hospital, they stabilize them, but they realize that the heart muscle is absolutely unable to sustain life. And those are the massive coronaries that you hear people dying. They drop and they're dead, or they have a massive heart attack and they're dead a day or two later when the extent of the heart damage is realized and the heart cannot sustain itself by itself. So those are massive, deadly heart attacks. Another name for a heart attack is a myocardial infarction. Okay, a myocardial infarction, an MI, that's just the fancy word for a heart attack. A heart attack is more oftentimes caused by a buildup of plaque in the coronary arteries. And on this exam, you can certainly expect a case study that will be focused around a heart attack. And you can see here, right, that the fatty deposits within the arteries block the blood flow. And that can be a slow, gradual blood flow blockage, but when it is a complete blockage, the person has complete blockage, that is going to be a full-blown heart attack. And again, depending upon which vessel and how big that branch is and how much muscle tissue there is distal to the blockage is really indicating how much of the muscle is damaged and the outcome of that heart attack. So definitely read through this. And we've talked about referred pain before. The classic, although not always, I mean, up to 60% of MIs present without the symptoms that I'm describing here. But there are a number of individuals who will feel that radiating pain in their left pectoral region and down their left arm. Some people feel faint. Some people start getting sweaty. They get nauseous or vomiting. They have shortness of breath. These are all signs of a heart attack. So don't only think about the left side. I just had a college friend post on Facebook that he was laying in bed, felt this little weird discomfort in his left, going down his left arm. He thought maybe he had slept on it funny. He moved around, and it wasn't going away. He played a mental game with himself, about how foolish he would feel if he went to the emergency room and it wasn't an actual heart attack. He has no history of a heart attack, no other indications. This was his first experience. He gets to the emergency room, and they say, it appears that you have not yet had a heart attack. They said you have not yet had a heart attack. His EKG was still normal, but he was still having this discomfort. And they left him there for observation for a couple of hours in the emergency room. Well, within 2 hours, he was having a full-blown heart attack. And thankfully, he was in the ER when it happened, and they were able to quickly put in 3 stents. So what's a stent? A stent is basically when the blood flow is blocked, and they go in and they do one of 2 things. Let me go down to a picture of it. Oh, let me say this before I go on. This area here, do not worry about this section. Yeah, we're not going to worry about this. I'm going to color this in blue, right, or 1 paragraph at a time. So this section, blue. Come on, John. Don't worry about this. Okay. Don't worry about this video that follows here. Okay. And this is just good to know. Right after a person's having an MI, right, you want to give that person oxygen. You want to give them aspirin, which works to break up the clot. And nitroglycerin is a chemical that's given typically to help with this, the blood flow. It vasodilates the vessels of the heart. Okay. And then if a person continues to have blood clots, they might give them agents that help dissolve the clot. TPA is one you may have heard about. I'm not going to test you on that. But let's take a look at what a stent is. Going down, and again, yeah, read through this. This is important. And what causes an MI? Not completely linked, but we know that cholesterol levels are a major player in this, and your LDLs, right? You want your LDL cholesterol to be low, your lows to be lows, and this is your bad cholesterol. So people with higher levels of LDL are more prone to heart disease, and you want high levels of the HDL. You want high levels of the HDL, and that's your good cholesterol, which is actually thought to be heart protective. So when you have your blood work done, you want low lows and high highs. We'll get to that picture of the stent in a moment. Read through this on the coronary veins. They're also referred to as the cardiac veins. These are the veins that are bringing blood back from the heart muscle, all dumping into that coronary sinus. So all of these cardiac veins drain back into the coronary sinus. Recall, the coronary sinus is also a way by which blood gets into the right atrium. So here's an angiogram. It's a visualization of the heart, and you can see the blood flow through the heart. And notice there are 2, they're pointing them out. And I wouldn't ask you to identify this, but you can see 2 constrictions, right, where blood flow is restricted. And that is where there is significant buildup of the plaque. And that buildup of plaque can lead to chest pain. And when that completely blocks, that would be a complete MI. And what they do, here it is. Here's what they do. They put in some chicken wire. That's my words. But they put in a mesh up into the vessel. That mesh is then expanded. It pushes that plaque off to the sides of the vessel and restores blood flow. So when you hear about somebody having a double bypass or having 2 or 3 stents put in, right? They've actually had this mesh put into their vessel. And if a person has, 3 or 4 stents, what it means is that they have 3 or 4 vessels that have significant narrowing. And thankfully, we have the technology now to go in and open up those vessels. So you can see examples of that here. They'll go in and do balloon angioplasty, bring a balloon in, expand that vessel, and then sometimes also bring up the mesh into that vessel. Again, if you have a single, double, triple, quad, doesn't matter. It just is referring to the number of these procedures that are done at one particular time. So that brings us to the end of 19.1. Do make sure you answer all of these questions at the end. Take a look at these labeling activities down here as well. And of course, don't forget about the vocabulary checkup. We have just a little tiny bit left, and it's very, very little. And it's about cardiac muscle, and we're only going this far. Okay, you're going to stop here. We're not going beyond conduction system of the heart. So all this is a quick review. I'm not going to spend any time on this right now. We've already seen this same diagram back in the histology unit, and remembering that cardiac muscle cells, you see the intercalated discs. The cells are still striated. You know that the striations are evidence of actin and myosin overlapping sarcomeres, and heart muscle cells or cardiomyocytes still have a lot of mitochondria. We need to make a lot of ATP, right, to run the pumping of the heart. And that an intercalated disc is really a combination of a desmosome. And we talked about desmosomes long enough. They're like those snaps or those rivets in jeans, places where they need some extra adhesive properties, and gap junctions, which are basically channels that allow molecules to move through. And these gap junctions are critical for the electrical activity that runs from one cell to the next. That's all I'm going to say about that. We'll learn more about how the muscle cells work in physiology as you learn about the physiology. The last thing is to remember, the heart is autorhythmic. This means you can disconnect the heart from the brain. The brain is not sending a direct signal for your heart to contract. Instead, in your heart, there are clusters of cells called the pacemaker cells. You'll learn a lot about these next semester. I'm not going to have you worry about them now, but these pacemaker cells set the rhythm of the heart. Remember the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic division turns up the heart rate, the parasympathetic turns down the heart rate, but the central nervous system does not initiate the heart rate. The heart itself initiates it. If a person's pacemaker, his natural pacemaker, is deficient, we now have the ability of putting in an external pacemaker. And that external pacemaker is now manually, right, electrically stimulating the heart for it to contract each and every time. So that brings us to the end of everything for chapter 19. Again, just a quick reminder about cardiac muscle, and stop here at conduction system of the heart. Let me just check. The only question that, skip all this EKG stuff, this will be next semester. You can answer the first question. At the end of 19, only worry about the first question. The other questions do not worry about. They're not content that you'll be responsible for this exam.